The grocery store was her refuge, a place where the humdrum of existence played softly in the background. For Marian, the aisles were a familiar rhythm, a quiet symphony of solitude that had accompanied her for years. She knew the staff by name, even if they rarely exchanged more than a polite nod, and the shelves carried the same predictable arrangements of canned goods and bread. At 52, her life had become a series of routines. Wake up, brew coffee, tend to the small garden outside her modest home, read, sleep, repeat. Widowed for nearly a decade, and with no children to tether her days to a sense of busyness, she had resigned herself to this quiet life. It wasn't a bad life, just an empty one, like a house kept tidy but never lived in. That Thursday afternoon seemed no different. The air was crisp with the early hints of autumn, the kind that brushed against your skin and reminded you of change. Marian wandered the produce aisle, her fingers grazing over apples as she inspected them. She heard the voice before she saw him, a warm baritone carrying a polite question to the store clerk about avocados. When she looked up, she saw a man, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s, with disheveled chestnut hair and a friendly smile that lingered as he laughed softly at something the clerk said. He exuded a kind of casual charm, dressed in a hoodie and jeans that suggested he had just come from a workout or a lazy day at home. Their eyes met briefly as he moved toward her side of the aisle. "Oh, sorry," he said, flashing a grin when she stepped back to make room. "No need to apologize," Marian replied, surprised at the lightness in her tone. He glanced at the apples she was inspecting. "Any good?" She smiled faintly. "Depends on what you're looking for, sweet or tart." "Sweet, definitely," he said, picking up an apple and studying it as if it held some great secret. "Try the Honeycrisp," she suggested, pointing. "Reliable sweetness." "Reliable, huh?" He chuckled. "Sounds like a glowing review. Thanks for the tip." And just like that, he was gone, moving down the aisle toward the dairy section. Marian watched him leave, her hand still resting on the apples. For the first time in years, something stirred in her, a fleeting spark of intrigue, a sense of aliveness that had nothing to do with the apples or the Honeycrisp she recommended. As she walked to the register, her thoughts lingered on the exchange. It was ordinary, unremarkable. And yet it wasn't. That night, as she sat by her window nursing a cup of tea, the image of his easy smile and the way he'd laughed softly over the apples returned to her. It was nothing, she told herself, just a stranger in a grocery store. But deep down, Marian knew that nothing in her life had ever felt quite so magnetic in its simplicity. Marian didn't expect to see him again. People came and went in the quiet town, their paths crossing briefly before disappearing into the rhythm of their own lives. But a week later, as she was placing a bag of flour into her cart, there he was again, standing in the baking aisle, staring at a row of chocolate chips with a furrowed brow. This time it was him who noticed her first. "Hey, Honeycrisp," he called out, a playful grin lighting up his face. Marian blinked, startled, before realizing he was referring to their brief conversation about apples. A laugh escaped her, soft and unguarded. "That's a first for me," she said. "A nickname inspired by produce." "Well, it stuck," he replied with a shrug. "Now tell me, baking expert, do I go with semi-sweet or dark chocolate? I'm trying to impress my sister with cookies, and I have no idea what I'm doing." Marian tilted her head, considering his options. Dark chocolate has a richer flavor, but if she has a sweet tooth, go with semi-sweet. Either way, she'll appreciate the effort. Good advice. He picked up a bag of semi-sweet chips, his expression light with gratitude. "I owe you one, Honeycrisp." They chatted for a few minutes longer, about cookies, then about recipes, and eventually about nothing at all. His name, she learned, was Ryan. He'd recently moved to town, trying to escape the noise of the city, as he put it. She found herself smiling at his easy demeanor, the way he made conversation feel effortless, as though they'd known each other far longer than a week and a grocery aisle could account for. "Well," he said, lifting the bag of chocolate chips, "I should get going before I manage to overthink the sugar content too." "Thanks for the help, Honeycrisp." "Anytime," she replied, watching as he walked away, her heart carrying a curious warmth she hadn't felt in years. Over the next few weeks, their encounters became oddly frequent. Once by the coffee aisle, another time near the checkout line. Each meeting carried the same playful energy, a growing sense of familiarity that felt, to Marian, like sunlight slowly pouring into a room she hadn't realized was dark. It was during one such meeting, as they stood outside in the crisp autumn air, that Ryan looked at her with genuine curiosity. "Do you ever stop by the coffee shop on Main?" Marian hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden question. "Not really," she admitted. "I usually just make my coffee at home. You should try it sometime." "They make a killer mocha," he said, slipping his hands into his jacket pockets. "Let me know if you ever want company." The offer was casual, almost nonchalant, but it hung in the air between them, carrying a weight Marian couldn't quite define. She nodded, smiling softly. "Maybe I will." As she walked back to her car that day, she realized how much lighter her steps felt. Ryan had become more than just a friendly face in the grocery store. He was a spark of warmth in her routine, an unexpected presence that made her world feel a little less lonely. And though she couldn't yet admit it to herself, Marianne had started to look forward to their chance meetings in a way that made her chest ache with an unfamiliar sweetness. Marianne prided herself on her composure. She wasn't one to let her emotions run wild, especially over something, or someone, so new and uncertain. But as the days turned into weeks, she found herself anticipating her errands with an eagerness that made her feel ridiculous. She began timing her grocery runs around the afternoons she'd last seen Ryan, hoping for another serendipitous encounter. It wasn't just his charm, though that was undeniable. It was the way he saw her, not as someone invisible, as she so often felt, but as a person worth speaking to, worth smiling at, worth knowing. Their conversation started to grow longer, spilling over from the grocery store into small exchanges on the street, by the coffee shop, and once even at the farmer's market. Ryan would share stories of his life in the city, his sister's antics, and his new hobbies like trying to grow herbs in his tiny apartment. Marianne found herself laughing more than she had in years, her heart feeling lighter with each shared moment. One chilly afternoon, as they lingered near the parking lot, Ryan tilted his head and asked, "Do you ever just get tired of routine?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes," she admitted after a moment, the honesty surprising even herself. "But I've learned to live with it. Comfort can be safe." Ryan smiled, though there was something searching in his eyes. "Safe isn't always the same as happy, though." The word stayed with her long after they parted. That night, as she sat with a book she couldn't concentrate on, she found herself replaying the conversation. Safe isn't always the same as happy. Was she happy? Or had she convinced herself that her quiet life was all she could hope for at her age? The realization of her growing feelings for Ryan crept up on her quietly, like a tide that had risen while she wasn't looking. It wasn't just friendship anymore. The way her chest fluttered at his grin, or the way her skin warmed when their hands accidentally brushed, it was undeniable. And it terrified her. What would he think if he knew? Would he laugh it off? Dismiss it as an older woman's misplaced emotions? The thought made her stomach churn. She told herself she was being foolish. The age gap was too wide, the circumstances too improbable. Yet, she couldn't stop the way her heart raced when she thought of him. The next time they met, her resolve to keep her emotions in check wavered. It was a crisp morning, and Marianne had reluctantly accepted his invitation to try the coffee shop. Sitting across from him at a small wooden table, she found herself leaning into his words, soaking up his energy like a flower turning toward the sun. "Do you know you're the first person I really connected with since I moved here?" he said suddenly, his voice soft and sincere. Marianne blinked, her heart skipping a beat. "I didn't realize. You have this way of making people feel at ease," he continued. "It's rare. I didn't think I'd find someone like you in this tiny town." She couldn't respond. The weight of his words and the warmth in his gaze felt too much, too close to what she dared not hope for. That night, lying awake in her bed, Marianne knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Her feelings for Ryan had grown deeper than she had ever intended, and they weren't going away. The question was, what would she do about them? Marianne spent the next few days in a state of restless uncertainty. Her thoughts were consumed with Ryan, his smile, the way his voice seemed to light up when he spoke to her, the gentle way he listened. But mixed in with the warmth of those thoughts was a storm of doubt and fear that left her feeling unsettled. She had lived with solitude for so long that the idea of opening herself up to anything more felt both exhilarating and terrifying. She had learned to rely on herself, to fill the emptiness with routines and small pleasures. But now there was something, and someone, waiting outside the walls she'd built around her heart. The idea of being vulnerable again, of allowing herself to feel something as intense as desire, made her stomach churn with unease. She wasn't a young woman anymore. She had long passed the time when relationships seemed simple and straightforward. Her experiences with love and loss had taught her that nothing was certain, that love, real love, was always fragile. And then there was the matter of age. What would people think if they knew? What would her friends say? Her neighbors, the people who had watched her grow older without ever mentioning a man. They would surely laugh at the absurdity of it. An older woman falling for a man young enough to be her son. The thought of their whispers, their sideways glances, made her stomach twist. Ryan deserved someone closer to his age, someone whose life hadn't already been lived, whose heart hadn't already been broken. He deserved someone who could give him the future he deserved, someone with no baggage, no hesitations. But in the quiet moments, when the doubts were momentarily silenced, Marianne found herself wanting him, wanting his presence in her life, his voice in her ear, his laughter filling the spaces of her days. The thought of losing this connection, of retreating back into the lonely comfort of her predictable world, was unbearable. That evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the darkening sky, she realized something. She was afraid. Afraid of what could be, but even more afraid of what would happen if she let fear hold her back. And yet, that fear remained, lingering in the corners of her mind, pulling her in opposite directions. Was she strong enough to risk her heart again? Was she foolish to want something so intense, so unpredictable? The next time Ryan called, inviting her for a walk in the park, Marianne felt a flutter of excitement, followed quickly by a wave of panic. She took a deep breath and, in that moment, made a decision. She would let herself feel whatever came next, no matter how uncertain, no matter the consequences. She had spent too many years in the safety of distance and routine to deny herself the chance for something real. But as she prepared to leave, the storm within her swelled again, stronger than before. What if she was wrong? What if this was all just a fleeting moment, a harmless crush that would only lead to heartbreak? Marianne pushed the thought away. Tonight, she would let herself be present. She would let herself take the step toward whatever this connection with Ryan might become. And, for the first time in years, she would embrace the unknown. The walk in the park was ordinary enough, or at least it started that way. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the path as Marianne met Ryan near the entrance. He greeted her with his usual warmth, a smile that made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't expected. "Hey, Honeycrisp," he said, his voice playful, but there was something else in his gaze. A quiet understanding, as if he sensed her inner turmoil, the hesitation that clung to her like a second skin. She offered a soft smile, her heart fluttering despite herself. "Hi, Ryan." They walked together, the cool evening air wrapping around them as they meandered through the park. The soft rustling of the leaves above them was the only sound, a gentle backdrop to the growing tension between them. Marianne's thoughts were a whirlwind, every step she took seeming both too fast and too slow. Ryan was talking, sharing a story about his niece and her latest antics, but Marianne found it hard to focus. She was acutely aware of him, the way his steps mirrored hers, the subtle way he adjusted his pace when she slowed down. She caught the glances he threw her way, the small, almost imperceptible shifts in his expression that told her he was aware of her discomfort. "I didn't realize how much I needed this," Ryan said, breaking through her spiral of thoughts. "I've been so caught up in work and adjusting to the new place. It's nice to just be, you know." Marianne nodded, her voice soft. "I know. I feel the same way." They fell into a comfortable silence, walking side by side, the tension between them unspoken but palpable. Marianne could feel it, the electric undercurrent of their connection, growing with each passing moment. It was a pull she couldn't ignore anymore, no matter how hard she tried. And then, as they reached a small bench by the lake, Ryan stopped. He looked at her, his expression serious, yet his eyes held a tenderness that sent a shiver down her spine. "Marianne," he said her name like it was something he had been meaning to say for a while. I'm not sure where this is going, but I want to see where it can go if you're open to that. The words hung in the air between them, and Marianne felt her breath catch. She had known it was coming, this moment where they would finally have to address the thing they had both been dancing around for weeks. But now that it was here, she was terrified. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest, the fear of what it might mean, the possibility that she could lose something, or someone precious if she took the step. But there was also something else, a quiet longing, a recognition that, perhaps, this was what she had been waiting for. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice trembling. I've spent so many years alone, Ryan. And I'm older than you, much older. I don't know if that matters to you, but it matters to me. Ryan reached out, gently taking her hand. His touch was warm, grounding, and for a moment, Marianne let herself sink into the comfort of it. It matters, he said, his voice low but steady. But it doesn't change how I feel. You're the person I want to spend time with. You're the person I want to get to know more. Age doesn't matter when it comes to connection. Marianne swallowed hard, her emotions crashing over her in waves. She had built her life on routines, on staying safe, on keeping herself at arm's length from the kind of love that could consume her. But here, with Ryan's hand in hers, with the sincerity in his eyes, she realized that the safety she had clung to was only a prison she had built for herself. Her heart beat faster. The fear still there, but tempered by something deeper, something she had long since buried. The hope that love could find her again, even in the most unexpected of places. With a shaky breath, she nodded. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Let's see where this goes. And in that moment, the world seemed to shift, the air around them humming with the promise of something new, something fragile yet real. For the first time in a long while, Marianne felt alive in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be. She was stepping into the unknown, her heart open to whatever might come next. It was a leap, yes, but for the first time in years, it felt like the right one. Ryan came over the next Friday evening, just as the fading light of day gave way to the soft glow of the street lamps outside. Marianne had spent hours preparing, setting the table with care, arranging fresh flowers in a vase, and choosing the perfect wine. Her nerves were a constant hum beneath her calm exterior, but she couldn't deny the sense of excitement that swirled inside her. When the doorbell rang, she almost jumped out of her skin. She took a deep breath before opening the door, her heart fluttering as she looked at him standing there, his expression warm and expectant, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers in his hands. Hi, Ryan said softly, his voice laced with a tenderness that made Marianne's breath catch. Hi, she replied, trying to steady herself. She reached out to take the flowers, their soft scent filling her senses, and smiled at him. You didn't have to bring these. I wanted to, he said, brushing his thumb against the back of her hand in a gesture that sent a shiver down her spine. These are for you. As she invited him inside, she felt a rush of warmth spread through her chest. The evening had felt like an impossible dream just days ago, her, a woman in her 50s, opening her door to a man who made her feel young again, alive with possibilities. And now here he was standing in her home, making all those doubts and fears seem so small and distant. They settled at the dining table, sharing dinner in a comfortable silence. There was an ease between them, a natural flow to their conversation as they talked about everything and nothing. Marianne found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, caught up in the gentle rhythm of their evening. Ryan leaned back in his chair, watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. I'm really glad we're doing this, he said, his voice low and sincere. I know it's not simple, but it feels right, you know. Marianne paused, the words settling deep within her. She had spent so much of her life avoiding things that didn't fit into neat, predictable boxes, things that didn't make sense in the conventional way. But now, as she looked at Ryan, at his smile, his warmth, his quiet understanding, she realized that this, whatever it was, felt more right than anything she had ever known. I know, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It feels right to me too. A silence fell over them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with the weight of unspoken feelings. Marianne's gaze dropped to her hands, and she could feel the tremor in her fingers, the uncertainty that still lingered deep inside her. The fear, the doubt. But when Ryan reached across the table and took her hand in his, It all seemed to melt away. "Marianne," he said gently, "I want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." His words settled over her like a blanket, soft and reassuring. She could feel the sincerity in them, the promise of something real, something that could endure beyond the surface of their age difference, beyond the doubts that had clouded her mind. As they finished their dinner, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, plans for the weekend, things they wanted to try together. Marianne felt an unexpected lightness in her chest, the weight of her years of solitude beginning to lift. She didn't feel old or invisible tonight. She felt seen. Later, as they sat on her couch, sipping wine and talking about books they'd both read, Ryan gently leaned in, his face close to hers. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet pull that neither of them had to articulate. And when their lips finally met, it was soft, tentative, like a question that only time could answer. Marianne's heart pounded in her chest, but there was no fear now, no hesitation, just the warmth of his touch, the gentle pressure of his lips against hers. In that moment, she let go of all the doubts, the questions, and allowed herself to simply be here with him. As they pulled apart, her mind was a swirl of emotions, but one thing was clear: she wasn't alone anymore. This was only the beginning. The days that followed were filled with an unfamiliar but welcomed intensity. Marianne's life, once quiet and predictable, began to pulse with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. Ryan was a constant presence in her thoughts, a warmth that curled around her in the mornings and lingered as she drifted to sleep at night. Their time together was unhurried. There were slow mornings spent at the coffee shop, afternoons wandering through the park, and quiet evenings in her home, where they would talk or simply sit together, sharing the kind of comfortable silence that spoke volumes. Marianne had once believed she had passed the age for such feelings. That desire, that deep, almost consuming connection, was meant for the young, the vibrant, the ones with all the time ahead of them. But as she moved further into this connection with Ryan, she found that love, true, undeniable love, didn't care about age or time. It didn't ask for permission, nor did it wait for the right moment. It simply arrived when it was meant to. One evening, after they had spent hours lost in conversation and laughter, Ryan held her hand, his thumb lightly tracing the lines of her palm. "You know," he said quietly, "I've never been more sure of something in my life." Marianne looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat at the depth of his gaze. "Of what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of us," he said, his voice steady. "Of you and me. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I want you in it. I've never felt this way before." The words struck her like a lightning bolt, and for a moment, she was paralyzed by the weight of them. It was the kind of confession she hadn't allowed herself to hope for, not after all these years. She had convinced herself that her time for that kind of love had passed, that it belonged to others, not her. But here it was, undeniable and real. Marianne swallowed, her throat thick with emotion. "I want that too," she admitted, her voice shaky but true. "I want you, but I'm scared. I've never." Ryan cut her off gently, his hand cupping her cheek with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I know, and I'm scared too. But we can't let that stop us, Marianne. Not now. Not when I know what we have is worth everything." Her breath caught in her chest, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of her fears begin to dissolve, replaced by something that could only be described as hope. It wasn't a certainty. It wasn't a promise of forever. But it was something. It was real. And that for now was enough. That night, as they stood at her doorstep, their hands lingering together, Marianne felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't sure where this would go, where any of it would lead, but for the first time, she didn't feel the need to have all the answers. She had spent so much of her life trying to control everything, trying to make sense of it all, but this connection with Ryan felt like the one thing she didn't need to figure out. It was simply something to embrace. "I'll see you tomorrow," Ryan asked, his voice full of hope. Marianne nodded, her lips curling into a soft smile. "Tomorrow," she echoed, her heart full. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of loneliness pressing against her. She felt light, alive, and ready to walk into whatever came next with him by her side. As the weeks passed, Marianne's life seemed to expand in ways she hadn't dared imagine before. Every day, there was something new. An unexpected text from Ryan, a shared cup of coffee in the early mornings, spontaneous walks through the city as the weather began to turn. She realized how much she had missed the little things, those moments of connection that made the world feel warmer, more vibrant. One afternoon, they sat together in a small cafe, sipping coffee as the world outside continued its rush. Ryan was telling her about a project at work, but Marianne found herself watching him more than listening. There was a quiet joy in the way he spoke, the way his eyes lit up when he was passionate about something. She found herself falling for him all over again, and this time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. Love, she had come to understand, wasn't about fitting into a box. It wasn't about following the path others had set out for you. It was about feeling seen and heard, about finding someone who made you feel as though time could stand still, even if just for a moment. When Ryan looked at her, his gaze soft yet intense, she felt all the years of loneliness, of waiting for something that would never come slip away. He was here, now, and that was enough. Later that evening, as they stood together in her living room, she realized something. This love wasn't just a fleeting thing. It wasn't some midlife infatuation that would fade as quickly as it had come. No, this was something deeper. It was real. And it was more than just a love story between a woman in her 50s and a man in his 30s. It was a reminder that love didn't care about the years between people. It cared about connection, about shared experiences, about the way two people could fit into each other's worlds. Ryan took her hand, his fingers warm against hers, and pulled her close. "I don't care what anyone else thinks," he whispered. "I only care about what we have." Marianne smiled softly, her eyes searching his, and for the first time, she didn't feel self-conscious about their age difference. She didn't feel the weight of society's expectations. She only saw him, Ryan, the man who had shown her that it wasn't too late to find love, to find connection. "You're right," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "What we have is enough." And in that moment, she knew that she had found something extraordinary, something rare. Love at any age was a gift, she realized. A gift that couldn't be measured in years, or expected to follow any set path. It was simply the joining of two hearts, beating together in time. And there was no right time for it to happen, just the right moment when it felt real. Marianne kissed Ryan then, a kiss that spoke of everything they had shared, and everything they would continue to share. In that kiss, she felt the truth of her journey. That love, no matter the stage of life, was always worth pursuing, always worth believing in. As they stood together, their hands intertwined, she knew that this was only the beginning, and she was ready to face whatever the future held, as long as she had him by her side. No longer afraid of the passage of time, she had learned the most important lesson of all. Love had no limits, no boundaries, no age. It was simply the desire to be with someone, to be seen, to share a life together. And she was finally ready to embrace it, without fear, without regret, and with an open heart.